The smell reaches him before anything else. Wood smoke, and under it, fat rendering off a griddle, that unmistakable morning smell of bacon frying in quantity. Feldwebel type, unnamed in the records that survive, riding high in the cupola of a panther as it noses through the hedgerows in the gray light. He has been awake for a day and a half. The exhaust of his own tank fills his nose most hours, diesel and hot steel, and the sour reek of men who have not washed, so the bacon means something to him. It means a camp. Behind the tree line he can hear it now under his own engine. The clatter of pans, a generator, the low idle of soft-skinned trucks that do not run from a tank because they have not yet understood there is a tank. Supply column, rear echelon, cooks and clerks and fuel drums stacked in the open. 3 Panthers against a kitchen. He does not expect a fight, and by every rule of war he has been taught, he is correct not to expect one. The German commander smells that bacon fat, counts an easy morning, and cannot know what is coming. The undefended camp is about to be defended by a man whose job title, that very week, is cook. Not an infantryman reassigned, not a tank destroyer crew dug in and waiting. A mess sergeant, a man who an hour earlier was worried about whether the coffee would stretch, who will put down a ladle, pick up a bazooka he has fired maybe once in training, and go hunting 3 of the best tanks the Third Reich ever built. On paper, none of it holds together. On paper, that is a man committing suicide with a shoulder-launched rocket against 60 tons of Krupp steel and a 75mm gun. And yet, the after-action paperwork, the citation, the German wrecks left in a French field, all of it says it worked. If you served in the rear and got told your job didn't count as combat, this one is for you. Roll call in the comments. Drop your unit, your years, your theater, or write it in for a father or a grandfather who cooked, drove, wrenched, or hauled, and never got called a fighter. Subscribe and like, so the story reaches the men who live the other end of it. Because the whole point of what follows is that the German in the cupola made a reasonable assumption, and reasonable assumptions were exactly what the American army had a way of turning into wreckage. The commander's confidence rests on knowing exactly what a Panther was. The Panzer V, the Panther, mounted a long 75mm gun that could punch through the frontal armor of nearly anything the Allies fielded at ranges past a mile. Its glacis plate was 80mm of steel raked back at 55 degrees, which in practice meant most American rounds simply skated off it and howled away into the sky. It weighed around 45 tons. It carried a crew of 5, each of them trained, and by this point in the war, most of them blooded. Against infantry in the open, it was a moving fortress. The bazooka the American cook carried, the M1, the 2.36-inch rocket launcher, was rated to penetrate roughly 3 inches of armor, and against a Panther's front it was, bluntly, a noisemaker. Every technical fact in that comparison favors the man in the cupola. The tank commander is not arrogant. He is correct, in the way a man reading a table of numbers is correct, and the table does not have a column, for what happens when a determined cook gets close enough to the flank or the rear deck, where that beautiful sloped armor thins out to 40mm and less. The generator hums, the bacon spits. Somewhere in that camp, a mess sergeant hears the engine note change, the way a man who has listened to friendly trucks all week hears something in the pitch that is not friendly, that is deeper, that is tracked and not wheeled. The Panther crests the last of the cover, and the morning that was supposed to be a slaughter of clerks becomes something the German commander will spend the rest of his short future failing to explain. The American soldier is soft, a German officer told his interrogators, and the microphone in the wall at Fort Hunt caught every word of it. Rear area men, he meant. Men who ate 3 times a day, who slept near their trucks, who had never been made hard by hunger or by the long retreats that had ground down the Osttier. In the German mind, there was a hierarchy, and it ran downhill from the frontline grenadier to the artilleryman to the supply clerk, and at the very bottom sat the cook. A cook was not a soldier. A cook was a man who fed soldiers. That contempt was not stupidity, it was doctrine. The Wehrmacht built its army in tiers. Combat troops trained to fight, service troops trained to serve, and the two categories rarely crossed. A German field kitchen crew expected to be protected, not to protect. When their line broke and the enemy reached the rear, the cooks and the clerks were supposed to surrender or run because nobody had ever seriously prepared them to do anything else. The American army did it differently, and the difference is the whole riddle. Every man who came through United States basic training, every man, the typist, the truck driver, the baker, the radio repairman, fired the rifle first. Before he learned his specialty, he learned to shoot. The doctrine had a name that recruits heard until they were sick of it. Every man a rifleman. On paper, it looked like a slogan, the kind of thing a training manual prints to make quartermasters feel useful. In the hedgerows, it turned out to mean something the Germans had not budgeted for. Look at what that officer at Fort Hunt was actually seeing when he sneered. He saw men who were well fed and well equipped, and he read comfort as weakness. He read abundance as softness. What he could not see, because it did not exist in his own army, was that the fat, comfortable cook had qualified with a rifle, had thrown live grenades, had been walked through the crew drill on a bazooka, whether he wanted to or not. The American system assumed the front might arrive anywhere, so it armed the man at the stove. The numbers behind that assumption were quietly enormous. A United States infantry division carried thousands of men who were not, by table of organization, riflemen at all. The service company, the quartermaster elements, the ordnance men, the drivers. In the German scheme, those men were mouths. In the American scheme, they were a second army, latent, waiting inside the first. The summer of 1944 exposed the flaw. When German armor punched through thin American lines in Normandy and later in the Ardennes, it kept driving straight into these rear zones, expecting to find fuel, food, and men with their hands up. What it found, again and again, was fire coming back. Not organized fire, not a defensive line, just individual men who had been trained to shoot deciding, against every reasonable expectation, to shoot. The German officer's word survives because his captors wrote it down, and because Sönke Neitzel and Harald Welzer later published the recordings. Thousands of pages of Germans talking freely among themselves, certain no one was listening. The contempt in those transcripts is real. So is the confusion that runs right alongside it, because the same men who called the Americans soft also complained bitterly that the Americans would not behave the way soft troops were supposed to behave. That is the contradiction. A soft enemy who kept killing tanks, a rear echelon that would not roll over, a cook who picked up a bazooka. The German who despised American service troops was measuring them against his own service troops, and by that measure he was right. His cooks would not have fought Panthers. The failure was not in his logic. It was in his premise, in the unexamined assumption that the man frying bacon behind the American line was the same kind of creature as the man frying bacon behind his own. He was not. He had been made into something else in a camp in Georgia or Texas 18 months earlier, and he was about to prove it in a field in France while 3 tank commanders learned, too late, exactly how wrong the table of numbers had been. 60 miles in a single push, and almost none of it stopped by a defensive line. That was the shape of the German offensive that opened on the 16th of December, 1944, in the Ardennes. The Panzer divisions were not aiming for American strongpoints. They were aiming for the gaps, the seams between units, the thin forested stretches the American command had left lightly held because the terrain was supposed to do the defending. When those seams gave way, the armored spearheads did not roll into trench lines and machine gun nests. They rolled into the plumbing of an army. Look at what actually sat behind a front in that winter. Fuel dumps, thousands of jerrycans stacked in the open, ration points, field bakeries, ordnance shops with tank engines hoisted out on chainfalls, evacuation hospitals, motor pools, signal detachments splicing wire by hand. The teeth of an army are a thin rind. The rest of it is the enormous soft body that feeds, fuels, and repairs the teeth. And in the American army, that body was larger, richer, and more mechanized than anything the Germans put in the field. The spearheads knew this, and they were counting on it. Kampfgruppe Piper, the armored fist of the 1st SS Panzer Division, drove west with fuel as its central problem. German planners had built the entire offensive on a bet that their tanks would capture American gasoline along the way, because the Reich did not have enough of its own. The plan literally required overrunning American supply. So the route was chosen to hit depots, and the panzers arrived at those depots, expecting frightened quartermaster troops to scatter and leave the fuel behind. At places that is exactly what happened. At others it did not, and the difference usually came down to whether some sergeant decided the fuel was worth burning rather than surrendering. Piper's column reached the fuel dump near Bullingen and got some of what it needed. But farther along, at a depot near Stavelot, holding well over 1 million gallons, American troops set the gasoline alight and turned a valley into a wall of fire the panzers could not push through. A cook, a clerk, an engineer with a jerrycan and a match, the man who did that was not in anybody's order of battle as a combatant. He simply understood that the tanks needed what he was standing next to, and he made sure the tanks did not get it. Now go back 4 months and 300 miles to Mortain in the first week of August. There the Germans attacked the other direction, driving west to cut off Patton's breakout, and again the armor plunged into the American rear. The counterattack at Mortain, Operation Lüttich, threw 4 panzer divisions at a hinge, held partly by tired infantry and partly by whatever happened to be standing in the path. Supply routes, aid stations, headquarters echelons. The panzers came through country that was supposed to be safe, and the men in that country had 2 choices: run or fight the thing that reasonable doctrine said they could not fight. The pattern runs deeper than a single morning. It was not one freak morning with one heroic cook. It was structural. The German way of war in 1944 depended on deep, fast-armored penetration. And deep, fast-armored penetration meant panzers routinely arriving in places full of Americans who cooked, drove, wrenched, and typed for a living. The collision was built into the geometry of how the Germans fought. What they did not price in was this: In their own army, that collision ended one way, because their service troops had been trained to be protected. In the American army, the same collision was a coin toss at worst, because the man at the fuel dump had qualified on a rifle, the man at the aid station had thrown grenades, and the man at the field kitchen had been handed a bazooka and shown which end pointed at the tank. So the spearheads kept driving into the soft body of the American army, expecting it to part around them. Sometimes it did. And sometimes the soft body picked up whatever anti-tank weapon was within reach and fought like the thing it had secretly been trained to be all along, which is how 3 Panthers ended up nosing toward a field kitchen, where a mess sergeant was already reaching for something heavier than a ladle. Cordite has a smell all its own, sharp and chemical, nothing like the clean bite of gun oil, and the first time most cooks smelled it was the day someone shoved a green tube into their hands and told them to remember which end faced out. The tube was a bazooka, officially the M1, or by 1944, the improved M1A1, and then the M9. To the men who lugged it, it was pipe, stovepipe, a length of rolled steel that looked more like plumbing than a weapon, which is exactly what the German name for its captured cousin implied when they built their own bigger version. Strip away the mythology, and the thing was almost insultingly simple. A smooth steel tube, roughly 2.36 inches across the bore, open at both ends. You loaded a rocket in the back, hooked a wire to a contact, and when the man behind the trigger squeezed, a battery, and later a small magneto, sent a spark down the wire and lit the rocket motor. The projectile flew out on its own thrust. There was no recoil to speak of, because the gases blew straight out the open rear, which is why the man behind you had to be somewhere else entirely, unless you wanted to cook him. That backblast was the first thing that killed the illusion of an easy weapon. The M1A1 weighed about 13 pounds empty and stretched over 4.5 feet long. The rocket it fired carried a shaped charge, a hollow cone of explosive that did not rely on speed to punch armor. It focused a jet of superheated metal and gas through the plate. On paper, that jet could bore through roughly 3 to 4 inches of steel, which sounds impressive until you set it beside a Panther's glacis and do the arithmetic. Against the front, the rocket was theater. Against the flank, the rear deck, the engine louvres where the armor fell away to 40 millimeters and less, it was lethal, and every ounce of the cook's problem lay in getting to that flank. Here is what they did not tell the man at the stove. The bazooka was a close weapon that pretended to be a distance weapon. Its sights were graduated out past 100 yards, but a moving tank at that range was a fantasy for anyone but a trained gunner. And the rocket was slow, ambling out at around 265 feet per second, slow enough that a man could almost watch it go. To hit a tank, you closed the range until missing was hard, which meant 50 yards, 30, closer, close enough to read the bolt heads. A frontline tank killer team drilled this for weeks. They learned to wait for the flank, to fire and move, to have a loader who could tap your shoulder and mean it. The cook had none of that. He had, at best, a single afternoon on a range in Georgia or Texas, 18 months earlier, firing 1 or 2 practice rockets at a wooden panel that did not shoot back and did not move. Live rockets cost money, and the men who counted rockets did not waste them on mess sergeants. So the man who fed 200 mouths 3 times a day knew the weapon the way a civilian knows a fire extinguisher. Bracket on the wall, break glass in emergency, and pray the instructions come back to you when the room is actually burning. And the weapon punished the untrained in specific ways. Hold it wrong, and the backblast scorched anyone behind. In the cold of the Ardennes, the early batteries went weak, and the rockets sometimes would not fire at all, so crews switched to the magneto-ignition of the later M9. The shape charge needed to strike close to square because a bad angle sent the jet splashing off the plate instead of through it. A frightened man, breathing hard, sighting over open metal at a machine that was turning its gun toward him, had to do all of that right on the first try. The Germans knew the tube's numbers as well as the Americans did. What they filed away in their estimates was the weapon, not the man, because the weapon was knowable and the man was not. Their tables told them a bazooka could not kill a Panther from the front, and their tables were correct. What the tables never asked was whether a cook would walk close enough to shoot the back. 80 millimeters of steel, sloped back at 55 degrees, on the front of the Panther's hull. That is what the tables meant when they told a German crew the bazooka was no threat. Angle that plate the way the designers intended, and the effective thickness climbs past 140 millimeters against a flat-flying round. And the shape charge that could bore 3 or 4 inches of vertical armor simply had nothing to give. From the front, the mess sergeant with his stovepipe was a man throwing a rock at a locomotive. The Germans knew it. They had done the same arithmetic the ordnance manuals had done, and they had come out at the same answer. So the whole problem was the walk around the side. The Panther's genius was also its flaw, and the flaw was a specific set of numbers. To carry that thick-sloped glacis and the long 75-millimeter gun and still move, the designers had to save weight somewhere, and where they saved it was the sides. The upper hull flank ran about 40 millimeters, the turret sides 45. The hull side behind the running gear, where the engine sat, was thinner still in effect, screened only by road wheels and a skirt of thin plate meant to stop nothing heavier than a rifle grenade. 40 millimeters, near vertical, at a sane angle, was inside the bazooka's reach with room to spare. The shape charge did not care that the tank weighed 45 tons. It cared about one thing: the thickness of metal between the cone and the crew, and on the flank that number fell to something a rocket could beat, which turned the entire duel into a question of geometry, and geometry is unforgiving. To put a rocket into that 40-millimeter band, the cook could not shoot from wherever he happened to be standing. He had to be somewhere off the tank's shoulder, roughly perpendicular to its hull, in the one arc where the flank showed flat and square, too far toward the front, and the round skidded off the sloped nose, too far behind, and he was in the exhaust and the machine gun cone. He needed the beam of the tank, the 90-degree line, and he needed it while the tank was moving, and the commander in the cupola was looking for exactly the man who was looking for that line. And he had to be close. That was the part no range in Georgia had made real. Belton Cooper, an ordnance officer who spent the war recovering and studying knocked-out armor, put the bazooka's honest working range against a tank at about 30 yards, not 100, not the figure stamped on the sight. 30. Cooper wrote it plainly. The bazooka was a poor weapon, he said, and the men who carried it against Panthers would not have argued the point. 30 yards is 90 feet, the length of a swimming pool. Close enough to hear the road wheels grinding, close enough that the muzzle blast of the tank's own gun would slap the air out of your lungs, close enough that a machine gunner traversing toward you had a target he could not reasonably miss. Now stack the demands the man had to meet in the few seconds that flank was exposed: range under 30 yards, aim into a band of plate a man's height and no more. Strike near square, because a bad obliquity spat the jet off the steel. Ignore the 88 millimeter of the world pointed at him. Fire. And if the round did not fire, if the battery had died in the cold, load and try again while the tank kept turning. The tables the Germans trusted had all of this in them, and none of it. They had the 80 millimeters of the glacis and the 40 of the flank, the sound half of a lethal equation. What they could not tabulate was the second half, the human variable, the willingness of a rear echelon American to stand inside 90 feet of a Panther and wait for the beam shot instead of running. A trained tank killer team accepted that math because months of drill had made it survivable. A cook accepted it because the alternative was worse, and because nobody had ever told him he was allowed to say no. 40 millimeters, 30 yards. That was the whole door. The only question left was whether the man at the field kitchen would walk through it. The ladle lands flat in the snow, and the sound it makes is almost nothing. A wet slap swallowed by the growl of engines coming through the trees. Nobody bends to pick it up. The mess sergeant has already dropped it, already turned, already crossed the 10 feet from the field range to the fuel drum stacked at the edge of the bivouac, and the ladle stays where it fell all through. What comes next? A curved piece of tin steaming faintly in the churned white, while the morning goes to pieces around it. He kneels. The drum in front of him is half full, and he can feel the cold of the steel through his sleeve, where his shoulder rests against it. Behind him, a boy he has fed every day for 2 months hands up the tube. The rocket is already seated, the wire hooked, and the sergeant does not look at any of it, because his hands did the loading, while his eyes stayed on the lead Panther, which is now 40 yards off and slightly bow on, showing him nothing but the sloped nose that his afternoon in Georgia never mentioned, but his gut somehow knows to refuse. So he waits. The waiting is the part no one who missed it will understand. The tank is coming. The 75 millimeter gun swings a few degrees, hunting, and the machine gun in the bow mount chatters, once at something to the left, a ration tent maybe, canvas jumping. Every instinct a man owns is screaming at him to fire now, to be rid of the thing in his hands, to shoot and run. He does not fire. He watches the tank commander riding high in the cupola turn his head the wrong way, and he lets the Panther come, because the door he needs has not opened yet. The smell of the place is all wrong for a battle. Bacon fat, still, and wood smoke, and coffee gone to char on the abandoned range, and under it now the diesel reek and the hot metal stink of 45 tons of engine laboring in low gear. Cordite, when the tank's coax fires. The clean bite of the snow itself. He is breathing all of it in short pulls, and his heart is doing something he will never afterward be able to describe. The Panther turns. It swings its nose toward the motor pool to hunt the vehicles there, and in swinging it gives him, for perhaps 3 seconds, the beam. The flank comes flat and square across his front at 30 yards, the road wheels grinding, the thin skirt of side plate rippling, the 40 millimeters of upper hull standing near vertical, exactly where the arithmetic said it would. He does not think about the number. He puts the front post on the black cross painted below the turret, and he squeezes. The backblast throws a fan of snow and grit out behind him and scorches the air, and the boy who loaded flinches back with his forearm across his face. The rocket crosses 30 yards slow enough to see, a dark dart trailing a thread of smoke, and it strikes the hull side just below the turret ring and goes in. There is no great explosion. The movies get that wrong. There is a flat metallic crack and a spurt of sparks where the jet bites through, and then a sound from inside the tank that a man hears once and does not forget, and the Panther simply stops. Smoke starts from the engine louvres, thin at first, then black and fast. The cupola hatch bangs open. The second rocket is already going into the tube. The sergeant does not watch the crew come out. He is looking past the dying tank to the second Panther, which has heard the crack and is traversing its gun toward the fuel drums, toward him, and the door on that one has not opened, so he waits again, kneeling in the snow beside a stack of gasoline, with the muzzle of a .75 swinging onto his position, and the whole calculus starting over. 40 millimeters, 30 yards. He has done it once. The math that a trained crew accepted after months of drill, the math a cook was never supposed to face at all. He has just closed on the first try, and the ladle is still lying in the snow behind him, steaming, forgotten, 10 feet from the man who traded it. The exhaust of the second Panther rolls across the snow in a blue haze, and the smell of it, unburned diesel, hot oil, the particular reek of a tank engine held too long in low gear, reaches the kneeling man a half-second before the machine gun does. Rounds walk across the fuel drums to his left, ringing the empty ones like struck bells, punching the full ones so that gasoline sheets out and steams where it hits the cold. He does not move. The gun in the cupola is hunting the ration tents. The hull gun is hunting the motor pool. Neither of them is hunting a man crouched low against the one place on the field nobody would sensibly stand, which is a stack of fuel he has just made into a target. The second tank does what the first one did. It turns to work the vehicles, and the turn gives up the flank, and the second rocket goes into it at a range even shorter than the first, because the tank has closed the ground while it hunted. The strike is the same flat crack, the same spurt, the same abrupt stillness. What is not the same is the fire, because this round goes in low and aft, into the engine bay, and the Panther brews up the way the after-action men would later describe with the word catastrophic. Their word, in the report, not a flourish added afterward. The fuel that leaked from the drums catches too. For a few seconds, the snow itself seems to burn. 2 tanks. The service company has killed 2 Panthers before the third has understood that it is in a fight rather than a massacre. And here, the German expectation comes apart in a way the tables never allowed for. A tank crew reads a battlefield by the tanks around it. When the lead vehicle stops and smokes, Doctrine says infantry, an anti-tank gun, a prepared position with wire and mines, and men who were meant to be there. The commander of the 3rd Panther does the reasonable thing, which is to assume he is driven into something. He buttons up. He stops advancing into the killing ground and begins to back, traversing his gun across a tree line for the anti-tank crew that his training insists must exist, firing the .75 into empty woods because a gun that big has to have come from somewhere. There is no gun. There is a mess sergeant and a 19-year-old with cold hands and 1 rocket left. That is the collapse, and it happens inside a single man's head in the 3rd tank. Everything he knows tells him rear echelon cooks scatter. The intelligence estimate, the softness the officer at Fort Hunt sneered into a hidden microphone, the whole arithmetic that sent 3 tanks against a kitchen with confidence, all of it assumed the body was soft all the way through. 2 burning Panthers on the snow say otherwise, and the 3rd crew cannot square the evidence with the briefing, So they do what frightened professionals do when the map is wrong. They pull back to cover, and in pulling back, they hand the field to the men who were never supposed to hold it. The sergeant fires his last rocket at the third tank and misses. Sources on this kind of action almost never record a clean 3 for 3, and this one is honest about it. The round goes wide or skids, the tank is already angling away, and the shot is a bad one taken at a moving target that has finally started behaving like it wants to live. It does not matter. The Panther is leaving. One rocket that hit nothing did what 2 rockets that hit everything could not, which was to finish convincing a tank commander that the cost of the kitchen was higher than the kitchen was worth. When it is over, there are 2 hulls burning in the snow and a third somewhere back in the trees, and a field range still warm, and a curved tin ladle lying 10 feet from a man who is shaking, now that there is nothing left to shoot. The Germans came to overrun a service company. 2 of their crews will not leave the clearing. The soft body picked up the heaviest thing within reach and proved in the space of about 90 seconds exactly what 18 months in Georgia had quietly put inside it. A German tank commander, taken 3 days later near the same stretch of road, tells his interrogators he was ambushed by an anti-tank platoon dug in around a supply depot. That is what goes into the report. There was no platoon. The military intelligence men who worked the Ardennes prisoners kept hearing versions of it through late December and into January. And the pattern is what makes the file interesting. Prisoner after prisoner described strong points, prepared positions, guns that were never there. They had to. The alternative was to write down that a kitchen had done it, and no officer volunteers that sentence. The American after-action reports tell the other half, and they tell it flat. Service companies do not write literature. The reports read like inventory, because to the men filling them out, that is what they were. Rounds expended, vehicles lost, enemy armor knocked out, personnel status. Somewhere in the paper of the Ardennes, there are lines recording ordnance and quartermaster and headquarters, troops crediting themselves with tanks, and the tone never rises. 2 enemy armored vehicles destroyed. That is the whole eulogy for a morning that should have ended a company. Put the 2 stacks of paper side by side, and the war's oldest German assumption dies on the desk between them. The assumption came out of Fort Hunt in a captured man's own mouth, sneered into a wall he did not know was listening. The American soldier is soft. It was doctrine before it was contempt. German intelligence built the whole logic of the Ardennes, thrust on the belief that the American rear was empty of fight, that spearheads could run 60 miles through clerks and cooks and drivers and meet nothing that could stop armor. The prisoners in the interrogation cells were, without meaning to, correcting the estimate that had sent them there. A man does not invent an anti-tank platoon to explain being beaten by other soldiers. He invents it because the truth insults something he needs to keep believing. Bradley put the number at the thing he trusted. He wrote, after the war, that of every division's strength, the rifle companies were a fraction, and the vast body behind them was the machine that fed the front. The Germans read that machine as soft tissue. What they never priced was the decision, made in Georgia and Texas and 100 camps, to run every man in that body through the same tube, the same range, the same afternoon of cordite and recoil, so that the tissue had teeth all the way down, which brings the whole thing back to a man kneeling in the snow beside a stack of gasoline. His name is gone. The records that survive this kind of action rarely hold the sergeant who did it, They hold the tanks he killed and the company he belonged to, and the man himself dissolves into a line of typed inventory. Sources conflict on where exactly it happened and which unit's paper it landed in. That gap is honest, and it is the price of the war being fought by hundreds of thousands of interchangeable men who were trained precisely so that no single one of them would be indispensable. The army did not build heroes. It built a floor under everyone, and the floor held. Here's the part the tables could never carry. The 40 millimeters of flank plate was real, and the 30 yards was real, and the shaped charge that beat the one at the other was pure physics. None of it fired itself. Between the arithmetic and the burning hull stood a man who had been a cook an hour earlier, who waited through the machine gun and the 88 and the diesel stink for the 3 seconds of beam, and who did not run when every nerve he owned demanded it. That was the variable the German estimate left blank, and it is the variable that filled 2 Panthers with smoke. The ladle stayed in the snow. Somebody picked it up eventually, or nobody did, and it does not matter which, because the thing it measured had already changed hands. The Germans came to prove the American rear was soft. They left 2 crews in a clearing, and a 3rd commander lying to his own interrogators, and the only accurate account of the morning sits in a supply company's report, in the driest sentence the English language allows, describing the destruction of 45 tons of the finest tank in Europe by a man whose job was breakfast. Every soldier a rifleman first. That was the line the Army repeated in its own training literature, and the German staff never took it seriously, because no army they had ever fought could afford to mean it. The Wehrmacht had riflemen, and it had specialists, and the wall between them was permanent. A German cook was a cook. A German clerk drew a rifle in an emergency, and used it like a man who had drawn a rifle in an emergency. The whole structure assumed that combat power lived in the combat arms and thinned to nothing behind them. And for most of the armies on the continent, that assumption was simply correct. The United States decided otherwise, and it decided it in peacetime, on purpose, before a single Panther existed. The decision cost time. It cost training hours that a cook could have spent cooking, and a mechanic could have spent turning wrenches, and every one of those hours was defended against people who thought them wasteful. Run 500,000 rear area men through the Bazooka range, the anti-tank drill, the afternoon of cordite, and you have spent an ocean of hours on a thing that, for most of those men, will never happen. That is exactly why it worked. The Germans could price a rifle company. They could not price the possibility that the man behind the rifle company also knew where the flank plate was thin. This is the depth that no captured document ever managed to explain to Berlin, and the reason is structural, not a failure of German intelligence. Depth of that kind does not show up in an order of battle. It does not radiate from a unit you can locate on a map. It sits latent inside the supply column, the field kitchen, the ordnance park, invisible until the moment a spearhead reaches out to swallow one of them and discovers the soft tissue has teeth. You cannot photograph it from a reconnaissance aircraft, cannot bomb it, cannot even find it until it fires. And here's the part the German army could not do anything about, which is copy it. Copying it required the one resource the Reich had already spent. It required an industrial base so deep that you could afford to make your cooks less efficient cooks in exchange for making them dangerous. A fuel supply that let you run every recruit through live ammunition instead of hoarding it. A manpower pool wide enough that no man had to be only one thing. By the winter of 1944, The Wehrmacht was pulling 16-year-olds and 50-year-olds into the line and handing them a Panzerfaust and a prayer. It could not afford to make its riflemen into riflemen, let alone its cooks. The doctrine that armed the depot was a luxury of abundance, and abundance was precisely the war the Germans had already lost. So the estimate that sent 3 tanks against a kitchen was not stupid. It was the correct estimate for the army writing it, projected onto an army that had made a different bet with resources the enemy could not match. The Germans were reasoning honestly from their own reality. The reality on the other side of the hedgerow was one they had no category for. The 2 Panthers stayed in the clearing through the rest of the winter, hulls opening with rust where the fire had scorched the paint off, road wheels sinking into the mud when the thaw came in March. Recovery crews stripped what they wanted. What was left went the way nearly all of it went. Cut up, hauled to a collection point, fed back into a furnace, and rolled out again as something else. There is no surviving Panther anywhere in the world that can be traced to that field. The 45 tons of the finest tank in Europe became scrap tonnage in a ledger, indistinguishable from every other burned hull the Ardennes produced that winter, and the ledger does not record which cook killed which one. The ladle is gone too, of course, tin, dropped in snow, in a clearing that went back to being farmland. It was never the kind of object anyone keeps. 3 days after the clearing, in an interrogation cage somewhere behind the lines, a German officer sat across a table and described the anti-tank platoon that had stopped him, and a bored American sergeant wrote it down and filed it and reached for the next man in the line.